A very good evening and welcome to our viewers. Today, we begin our journey with the premiere episode of the series People Should Know. I, Dr. Vaishnavi Tiwari, am your host for today's session. People Should Know is a new series that has been launched by the Indian Youth Nuclear Society, and it aims at inviting leading experts to discuss about the facts and details of history in a manner that is comprehensible to the general public. Today, we have with us Sri Swapnesh Kumar Malhotra, who is the Secretary of the Indian Nuclear Society. Sri Malhotra has been associated with the DAE and the Bhabha Atomic Research Center in various R&D activities that have been related to heavy water, which is an important nuclear material for the Indian nuclear program. Sri Malhotra was also the head of Public Awareness Division at the DAE since 1999, and he has been tirelessly working on creating mass awareness about the atomic energy program of India by planning, assessing, and overseeing the entire outreach program of the DAE. For this work, he has received several accolades from the Indian Nuclear Society, the Department of Atomic Energy, and the Public Relations Society of India, to name a few. Welcome, Dr. Malhotra.
Thank you, Vaishnavi. A very good evening to you and all the viewers. You can start firing the questions.
Thank you, sir. Before we begin our journey, we all know that the Indian face in terms of nuclear industry is a big one. India has an elaborate nuclear program, and it is considered to be one of the leading comes to having its own nuclear power program. So my first question would be if you could tell us a little bit of a brief history about the conception of the Indian nuclear program, and especially in terms of the India's three-stage program that we have.
See, look, presently, whatever nuclear power program is there, right from the inception, it's a planned program. It's not happening just like that. In a very planned manner, it has been going on. But surprisingly, the inception of the atomic energy program is not with a planning. It happened by an accident. And the accident was that World War II had started, and that time a young physicist and engineer already established on international arena, he came for a vacation to India from UK and got stranded. Now, this was the accident, which ultimately resulted in Indian nuclear power program, or rather Indian atomic energy program starting. This young gentleman was none other than Dr. Homi Jahangir Bhabha. And since he had nothing else to do, he was getting frustrated. So I think in one of those moments, he wrote a letter to the Tata Trust, Sir Dorabji Tata Trust, that he wants to start atomic energy program in India. I'll cut short the story. And the net result was that within a year, in 1945, Tata Institute of Fundamental Research started at Mumbai. And it started from the bungalow in which Dr. Bhabha was born. It was his aunt's bungalow. A portion of that he took from his aunt, I think 2 or 3 rooms. So from there, the journey started of TIFR. And then, of course, it's a long journey, the present campus of TIFR and all. But within 3 years, Atomic Energy Commission was established on 10th August 1948. Things were really moving very fast, but there was no Department of Atomic Energy in Government of India. In the Government of India setup, there has to be a department for carrying out an activity. So this Atomic Energy Commission was under the Department of Scientific and Industrial Research, TSIR. But in 1950, 1954, a separate independent Department of Atomic Energy was born on 3rd August 1954. And with that, a proper Department of Atomic Energy in existence since then. And the first research reactor of India, not only of India, of entire Asia, including Japan. I mean, the Asia I am referring to includes Japan. So, because this is very important for the youngsters to know. They will think that all good things must have happened in Japan first and later in India. So, for their particular information, I am telling that for the first time in Asia, a nuclear reactor of any kind was put up, which attained first criticality in 1956. And it was officially commissioned on 20th January 1957. Okay, so the name of the reactor was Apsara. It was so named because the then Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, he said, it appears so good, he peeped into it's a swimming pool type of reactor. So he peeped into it and he saw that beautiful blue color coming out of that water. So he said it was looking like a damsel. So he just named it as Apsara, again in an unplanned manner. So with this, I would say the atomic energy program took off in India. And then, of course, in 1955, Dr. Bhabha presented his, first paper, I think in co-authorship with one Dr. Prasad, if I am correct. I think in that co-authorship, they presented a paper which in detail showed that they proposed a three-stage Indian nuclear power program. And nowadays, I wonder, actually, often last, I would say almost, how many? 44 years. I am myself involved in atomic energy program. But even after 44 years, I really wonder that how in 1955, she could come out with a robust, it's not just a piece of paper. It's a robust program of India's, nuclear power program, which he has planned, that even after these so many years, we have not been able to drift from this program. We might have added something to it, I don't think we have removed anything from the program. We might have only added something to it, but we have not at all deviated from this program. And as a part of this, in fact, people often ask me that, but the first two reactors, they were light water reactors, which were not essentially part of three-stage program, because in 1955, the paper he presented, he essentially said that it will consist of the first stage consisting of pressurized heavy water reactors. Second stage will be based on fast breeder reactors. And the third stage will be based on fuel. I mean, reactor he did not know at that time, but he said third stage will be. So basically, these three stages, they are, in fact, I would say, they are based on the fissile material they are employing. So first stage basically employs uranium-235 as the fissile material. Second stage employs plutonium-239 as a fissile material. And the third stage is supposed to employ thorium-based fuel, fuel derived from thorium. So this is a unique program to India. And in fact, I'm very proud to tell, as an Indian, even you should feel very proud, that probably India is the only country which, right from its inception of the nuclear power program, intends to use all the three fissile. See, these are the three fissile materials known to us. On an industrial scale. And we have shown our intentions right from the beginning that we will be using all the three of them in a sequential manner. And so essentially our light water reactors, way back in 1969, two boiled water reactors, they were put up. And but the first PHWR, which you should say, which kick-started the first stage of the nuclear power program, that was put up in 1972 in collaboration with Canada. That time PHWRs were popularly known as CANDU reactors. And so this is how the story began.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for this brief yet really comprehensive and detailed history of our program. And in fact, I would say that over the time since, I mean, in the recent past, we've seen that the nuclear power program has gained a lot of recognition and I mean, people all around the world are familiar with nuclear energy in general. But ever since this recent Fukushima accident, there was a little setback in terms of people questioning the safety and the reliability of nuclear power. So, in this context, how can we say that the India's three-stage program is unique and different from other nuclear nations, keeping in mind the safety as well as the technology advancement for the nation?
Okay. Now, before I really delve into the three-stage program, I'll catch up a statement you just made. You said when there was Fukushima, I mean, there were safety concerns. People, they had second thoughts about nuclear power. I think I would say this is the normal human tendency. Not only in nuclear power. I can give you an example. Probably, I personally feel it fits in and it best explains at least India's position. See, there can be accidents in any technology. That does not mean that you give up the technology. So I give an example from my personal, I would say, childhood. In my childhood, probably when I was 8 or 10 years old, I was learning to ride a bicycle. And I think as happens with all of us, maybe on the third or fourth day of my bicycling, when my father suddenly left the bicycle and asked me to be independent. And after maybe 10 meters or so, I fell from the bicycle. And maybe there was an injury on my knee. And that night there was swelling. And I declared, with my mother as the witness, at night 12 o'clock, I declared to the world. And the sole witness was my own mother. I declared I will never ride a bicycle in my life. It is very dangerous. While crying, I did that. After 5-6 days, I forgot about it. I was back on the bicycle. I fell another time. Probably I was hurt a little more. I made another announcement, similar announcement. Maybe third time I broke my leg, I fractured. This time it was a more serious announcement that I will never ride a bicycle. But even today I ride a bicycle. So I think it's a human tendency to say so. I think we should not take ourselves very seriously, at least when we are making such announcements. Because in a technology, if an accident happens, yes, maybe that we will get infuriated and we will make some announcements. But I think if the senses prevail, good senses prevail, we will come back to the same technology. So this is the story. Now coming back to the three-stage program, that how it is unique as compared to other nations. See, other nations, their nuclear program is essentially it is based on availability of fuel. Of course, ours is also based on the similar thing and availability of a particular reactor design. So they had the advantage or the disadvantage that they had taken a lead. The other countries, basically the 5 big brothers, if you name, of nuclear energy. So they had taken a lead. So they were going with the reactors as they were developing them. In India, as I said, I think we started, as far as nuclear power program is concerned, we started about 10, 15, or maybe 20 years later than the most advanced countries. Okay. See, they started thinking of nuclear power program in 1953 and put up the first reactor maybe in the early 60s. We put our first reactor in 1969. So maybe we were 15 years behind them. So we had the advantage. We were watching them falling from their bicycles. So we were learning from there. At the same time, we were also seeing what models of bicycle are available in our country, what kind are available to us, and what kind of puncture wala shops will be available in future in India. Okay, so this is how we were shaping our program. Our program is basically linked to all, as I told you, they probably, while starting their program, they bothered only about uranium 235 at that time. But when we did not know anything, even at that time, we knew one thing, that we will be using all the three fissile materials and in a sequential manner. So we made a program that in the first stage, we will create fission of uranium 235 to generate power and to generate the fuel for the second stage. And in the second stage, we will be burning the fuel achieved from the first stage, and we will be generating a fuel for the third stage. So that's the beauty of this program. So with very limited availability of resources of uranium in India, we could encompass a very large program. I think if I give you an example, if we look at the indigenous resources available, as you know, the natural uranium which is available in the country or anywhere in the world, it contains only 0.7% uranium 235. Okay, whether it is Canadian uranium, American uranium, African uranium, or Indian uranium. Everywhere on the earth, at least. I don't know on other planets, some other ratio might be existing, but on earth, always natural uranium will contain 0.7% uranium 235. So knowing that what are our resources, so I am talking of, when we started the program, we knew very well that if we compare the relative sizes of resources, then U-235, then plutonium 239, and uranium 233, which is derived from thorium, their ratio is 1 is to 130 is to 475. So we knew very well that we will make a small beginning with uranium 235, and it will give us only limited nuclear power, but it will give us tremendous amount of fuel for the second stage, 130 times more potential than its own potential. And similarly, the third stage will give even larger, 3 times the potential of the second stage. So this is the uniqueness of India's program, that it is like normally we talk of normal pyramids. Our nuclear power program is an inverted pyramid. When we start from a meager point of very less amounts of uranium 235, and then we go on widening our scope. And ultimately, see, just to give you an example, I think if we talk only of Indian resources, then in terms of first stage, we have a potential of 328 gigawatt electric years. Okay, so you can have 10,000 megawatts, so essentially 10 gigawatt for 30 years, or you can have 300 gigawatt for 10 years. Choice is yours. And similarly, the second stage, the same, this potential, by the same mining, without any additional mining, from 10 gigawatt, you are raising it, from 328 gigawatt electric years, you are raising it to about 44,000 gigawatt electric years. And in terms of thorium, we intend to raise it to, I think, 150,000 gigawatt electric years. So that's how a growing program. I think this is the typical uniqueness of Indian nuclear power program.
Okay, thank you, sir. In fact, I'm actually very thankful that you explained this entire thing in terms of the general terminology. As people usually, when they look at any process, it's basically for them either a top-down pyramid or a bottom-down. So explaining it in that sense was that's a new way I have learned to explain what the nuclear program for India is and how it is unique. And speaking of the program and the use of fissile material, so you said that there is in the Indian India's three-stage program, we are using all the three fissile materials. And in the nuclear community, we are really familiar with the terms that are the closed and the open fuel cycle. But for our viewers, could you maybe explain what this closed and open fuel cycle and again by explanation, can you link it to the India's three-stage program?
Oh, yes. In fact, very appropriate question. There cannot be a sequential program like Indian program, sequential program where one stage uses the available fissile material and gives you fissile material for the future stage. Now, this is not possible in an approach called, the usual approach the world normally takes, the open fuel cycle. First, let me explain for the viewers what it actually means. It means, I would say in today's terms, if we say use and throw. Nowadays we have a lot of things which are use and throw. Now the world is learning it was a very wrong step. Earlier we used to say, in right from medical to food to so many things, electronics industry itself. The world in last 30, 40 years, I saw had moved to this use and throw policy. Just use once and throw it out, which is, as per me, is a criminal waste of resources in anything, not only in nuclear. So I think most of the countries which are following the open fuel cycle, I give another name, that is use and throw. That means you mine uranium, use it once, and throw in the sense, okay, you are not throwing on the streets, but throw means keep it somewhere without realizing that actually, if you see the fuel potential, I think when you speak about coal, or fossil fuels, you speak of calorific value. What is the calorific value of a fuel? So I think if I am allowed to use that term in nuclear fuel also, normally we don't use, but if I am allowed to, then the calorific value of the virgin fuel and calorific value of the used up fuel, which normally we call as spent fuel. The calorific value of the spent fuel is orders of magnitude higher than the original, calorific value of the original fuel, which essentially means the amount of electricity you can produce from the virgin fuel, and you compare it with the electricity you could produce from the spent fuel, that will be much, much larger. So as per me, it is criminal not to use it. So now what is Indian approach? Indian approach, a typical, I think, whether it is the sweet meat dabba which comes every Diwali to our house. We are the guys, Indians are the guys who believe in reprocessing. Any material first, we will use it in this way, then in this way, first from this side, then from this side. And ultimately we will, we will find some alternate use till there is no other option than throwing it. So we are expert in that. So in fact, I would say it flows in our blood. So even when we became nuclear engineers and nuclear scientists, I think that basic concept was flowing in our blood. So right from the beginning, we have believed in closed fuel cycle. What it essentially means that after you have used up a fuel, it is not an ash. When coal burns, you get ash. But when a fuel burns, it is not an ash. It is a fresh resource material, as I told you, containing even much more calories as compared to the original fuel. So we need to reprocess it, and we need to recover whatever material is useful to us. This is what we call as closing the fuel cycle. Closing the fuel cycle means, see, we take out from the mine something and we go on using and recycling it. go on, I mean, in a circle, we keep on going. That is why it is a closed fuel cycle. Open fuel cycle means you do the mining, part of the mined substance you use, and with potential still left in that material, you again bury it in the earth. So you have not used the full, you have not completed the circle. So it is a open fuel cycle. And where we are completing the circle, we are going on reusing the material. We call it as closed fuel cycle. And as I told you, closed fuel cycle is a necessity for a three-stage nuclear power program.
Thank you, sir. In fact, yes, I totally believe that a closed fuel cycle is required in given the present scenario, global energy context. In this context, it is actually very crucial for a sustainable, development of not just our nation but also for the entire world, I would say. So you used the term nuclear processing. So during this conversation, could you explain to us what exactly it entails? As in, what are the kinds of steps that are being employed to actually use the spent fuel and make it into something which is useful in future, and also how it is important in the Indian context in terms of the different stages that we have.
I'll do that. So as I already told you that essentially the word I used was nuclear reprocessing. Okay, that's the word, nuclear reprocessing. What does it mean is when you put a fresh fuel in a nuclear reactor, after certain time, when you feel that either the fissile material is over in that, or no further use can be made, you take out the fuel. When you take out the fuel, one way is, as I told you in the open fuel cycle, that you bury this fuel somewhere. I mean, I don't want to criticize anybody, but this is the system which USA has been following and many other countries have been following. I'm giving USA's example because it very naturally comes to our mind. So they mine uranium, make fuel, put it in the nuclear reactor, take out the spent fuel, cool it off for some period, and they need a place like Yucca Mountain or some other place to put that entire fuel. But here in India, what we have done is that, again, since we had decided right in the beginning that we will be going for three-stage program, so we immediately, in fact, our reprocessing plant came before our power reactor came. See, as I told you, our first stage nuclear power reactor, first PHWR, came in 1972. But our first reprocessing plant came in 1965. So we learned how to reprocess the fuel before actually there could be a spent fuel. So this is the advantage we took. As I told you, we saw other people learning bicycles. So we learned a lot from there. So we learned that first you learn how to reprocess the fuel. Now what essentially it means, separating the contents of that spent fuel. Now typically a spent fuel, let us compare a virgin nuclear fuel and a spent nuclear fuel. So in PHWR, for example, it is consisting of natural uranium. So in majority, it will contain, fresh fuel will contain 0.7% uranium-235 and 99.3% uranium-238. That's the starting material. Now compare with the spent fuel. Now what has happened? Part of that 0.7% uranium-235 has undergone fission. So it must have got converted into fission products. When fission happens, the nucleus breaks into smaller nuclei. So practically the entire periodic table is available in that spent fuel. Okay? Entire periodic table means you name an element and its isotope will be there in that. So that means whatever part of 0.7% uranium-235 has undergone fission, that will be present in the form of fission products. Okay. Now there will be some unconverted uranium-235. I mean, it's not that you really converted all the uranium-235. So some unconverted, very small amount will be left behind. So that will be there. Then lot of uranium-238 will be there, because you could not convert all the uranium-238 into, you didn't have so many neutrons that you could convert all of it into plutonium. Okay, so some of it might have got converted into plutonium, but a majority must be left behind. So now the composition will be from earlier binary composition. I'm talking in terms of these nuclear materials. I mean, don't challenge me that oxygen is also there, nitrogen is also there. Okay, other element. I'm talking of nuclear materials. So initially it was a binary mixture of uranium-235 and uranium-238. Now it is a very complicated mixture containing uranium-235, uranium-238, plutonium-239, and fission products, the actinides and iodine-131 and ruthenium-106. I think you go on taking the names of the elements and they are present there. So now our job is, if we want to reuse this material, now this material directly we cannot reuse. It is highly radioactive as compared to the original fuel. Okay. And in fact, it contains certain isotopes which are highly neutron absorbing kind of thing. So in fact, it is impossible to make a nuclear fuel from this mass available after the previous stage. So you have got to reprocess it. You have to separate different components. You have to separate out fissile component, the fertile component, and the fission product component. So separate streams you have to make. It's a very, very complicated chemical engineering challenge, and added to the complexity of the separation process is the fact that it cannot be done in open. It has to be done remotely because it is highly radioactive. So it has to be done in hot cells. That is, I mean, in an area which is secured from where radiation cannot come out. So it has to be done in remotely. So very complicated technology. But yes, we played with it. And right in 1965, we had developed first plan, very crucial for us. So I think I have essentially replied to you that what is reprocessing technology. And I think I'm very clear that its importance to in Indian context is that we can have the three-stage program successful. We can move from one stage to another stage only if we have the reprocessing technology. So here, in fact, I would often, people ask me, I don't know whether you are planning to ask, people ask me, you started with light water reactor and you are now moving to light water reactor. How come so? So, in fact, here I would only tell, I will answer the part of question that the first two boiling water reactors of General Electric, which are there at Tarapur in the form of Tarapur 1 and 2, they are outside the gamut of three-stage nuclear power program. Because at that time, whatever was the agreement between India and the General Electric and the US government was that we will make, like them, we will make only one-time use of fuel given by them. So we are not supposed to reprocess. And at that time, probably this is, I would say, the early child's step. Probably we should have taken care. But maybe I do not know the reasons why it happened. That why we agreed for this. So we cannot do the reprocessing of the these two plants. Okay, so essentially these two plants, the boiling water reactors, they are outside our three-stage nuclear power program. They essentially contribute some electricity to our program, but they don't contribute to our three-stage nuclear power. Okay, so that is very important. So we will have three-stage nuclear power program only if reprocessing is there. If there is no reprocessing, if we had not developed the reprocessing technology, if world had not given us the reprocessing technology, which it has not given. I mean, fact is we developed on our own, we would be behaving like other countries. We would not be proudly singing about the three-stage nuclear power. So it is an integral part of three-stage nuclear power program, a very, very important step.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for this answer. In fact, yes, you're right. I was going to ask you why we shifted from
you can still
light
ask
water
because
reactors.
I can elaborate, because I have not answered why we are now going for the light water.
Yes,
I
yes,
only
definitely.
have only given you information that those two old BWRs are not part of our three-stage nuclear power program.
Absolutely. I will definitely come back to this question.
Yeah.
But before that, there is one question which is, it comes in the mind of people usually when we say that we are trying to reprocess the nuclear fuel. So it's actually a two-part question. So the first is what factor what factor determines when exactly the fuel needs to be reprocessed? Because we in the nuclear community, we know about the fuel cycle and the time for which the fuel is actually supposed to be irradiated or can be used to generate electricity. But what other factors can decide when it is time to change the fuel or maybe take it out for reprocessing? And second part is that how does the India's three-stage program solve this issue of nuclear waste, like you said about the different radioisotopes? So what are we doing in the program and also otherwise to take care of this nuclear waste issue in India?
Okay. So I will start with the first part of your question. I think what was the first part? I'm sorry. The first part you asked was about.
So when do we decide that it is time to reprocess the fuel? Yes, sir.
Yeah, it's a very important thing. See, why have you put a nuclear fuel in a nuclear reactor? So as to produce electricity. Okay, to generate electricity. Now, as long as it is generating electricity in a manner, it is going on giving us power to generate electricity in an economic manner, we will naturally go ahead. Okay. But when we find that this nuclear fuel, though there might be some behind in that, but it is not economically giving us electricity now, or is not giving in a safe manner. These two are very important aspects, the economy of it and the safety involved. That means that is the time that you take out that fuel and load the reactor with fresh fuel. Now, coming back to our PHWRs, because that is the first stage. Essentially, the first stage is PHWRs. So, in PHWRs, we have very less amount of fissile material, as I already told you, only 0.7%. So, this has to be done more often, because that fissile material will be over within no time. You compare with a light water reactor containing, let us say, 4% uranium-235. And here we have only 0.7%. So let us say 1/5. So 1/5 of what a light water reactor is using. So that means if that reactor is able to go for 2 years, or let us say 20 months with a load of fuel, so 20 divided by 5. So every 4 months I will have to do it. So that is why, since every 4 months I cannot take normally in a light water reactor, you take a shutdown. You stop the reactor, remove the spent fuel, load with fresh fuel, again seal it off, and again start. So essentially a batch process. And typically, I think most of the light water reactors, I think if I remember correctly, maybe around 2 years or so is that period, 1.5 to 2 years, or maybe in some reactors it could be slightly more than 2 years. But I think it is around that. But in PHWR, if we start doing it, then as I told you, in a year, maybe 2 or 3 times we will have to take shutdown. So right from the beginning, the PHWR technology has been developed with an online refueling. this is an essential part of the design of PHWRs. So typically, if you compare the fuel of a PHWR and the fuel of a light water reactor, there is a term called fuel burnup. Now, I'm not going to bore your audience by defining it, but it means, see, this term essentially means how much electricity has been generated already from per ton of this fuel. Per ton of fuel, how much electricity has already been generated. So it is typically defined in terms of megawatt days per ton. So from 1 ton, how many megawatt days of electricity has been generated. Now in PHWR, this is the minimum. Actually, I mean, because after that, what happens when a lot of uranium-235 gets converted into fission products. So amount of U-235 available is very less, and now fission products have taken over. Lot of fission products are there. Many of them are neutron absorbing materials. So whatever little neutrons that leftover uranium-235 is generating, majority of those neutrons is being absorbed by these fission products. So that means the fission chain reaction is not able to proceed in a very nice manner, and in an economic and safe manner, electricity cannot be produced. So we have to take out the PHWR fuel earlier as compared to light water reactor. Okay, so that is why we have kept, rather than shutting down the reactor every few months, it is online refueling. So, and we have fuel bundles. We don't have long rods. In light water reactor, you have long rods because you are not going to move them. Here we have fuel bundles, less than a meter long, small bundles, and we keep on pushing them from one side. So by that, see, they keep on pushing. The fresh bundles keep on pushing the old bundles, and finally those old bundles, they fall out from the other side, and they are taken out as the spent. Okay, so now coming to the second part of your question, that is nuclear waste related. See how this closed fuel cycle is helping in handling the waste or managing the waste. Now, when you are working with open fuel cycle, okay, the entire spent fuel is being treated as waste, at least for the time being. That means you have to find a place where to store this entire fuel of a reactor. So much larger space is needed. Now, this is highly radioactive. Okay. So naturally, you need a space which is away from the public domain. It is not exposed to public domain. Even if public by force wants to enter it, should not be able to enter it. So all those issues are involved. So a huge volume of place is required to store all this. But when you are doing reprocessing, so you are not doing it in a cumulative manner. So as the spent fuel is coming from the reactor, I mean, depending upon a delay, because you need to cool it down for some time. So maybe for after 2 months, 3 months, or even 6 months, you take out and you reprocess that. While you are reprocessing that, fresh spent fuel will come out. You will reprocess. So you don't require a very large space. You require a much smaller space for doing the reprocessing. Now, at the end of typically look at a spent fuel of PHWR. What will it give? It will give definitely less than 0.7% high level waste, because see, 0.7% was the uranium-235. Only a part of that has got converted into fission products. So that means fission products cannot be more than 0.7% of that. Okay, but actually, to tell you the truth, when we do the reprocessing, it is only about 0.1%, which comes out as high level waste. Because there are some radioisotopes, there are some fission products which are short lived. So by the time we do reprocessing and we do everything, the cooling off period, many of the radioisotopes, they die. Many of those fission products, they die their own death. Normally in our terminology, we say that any radioisotope, if it has spent 10 half-lives, that means its radioactivity is over. So let us say it takes about 2 years for us to reprocess the fuel. Whatever fuel generated from a reactor, we are able to reprocess it in 2 years only. So in 2 years, all the 2 years means 24 months. So all the radioisotopes which had half-life of up to 2 months, around 2 months, they would have died out by this time. So just to give you an example. So actually, high-level waste is the waste which contains those long-lived actinides and long-lived radioisotopes which are going to live for thousands of years. That is essentially the high-level waste. Okay, so that is around 0.1% of the original fuel volume. So that means now you will be requiring much lesser space. Now some people argue. Now here I will give you the argument. Earlier, you had that all the radioactivity confined in, let us say, you are able to see my hands. So all the radioactivity was in this much volume. By reprocessing, you have brought it to this much volume. So now people will say, but this is much more radioactive as compared to your this mass. So I only have a very humble suggestion. We know that if something is hot, it will burn our skin. Isn't it? Now, if something is 100 degrees centigrade or it is 500 degrees centigrade, both are going to burn us. Isn't it? No, I cannot get away by saying that, no, 100 degree means relatively safe. No, 100 degrees centigrade body is also going to burn my skin and 500 is also going to burn my skin. Okay. So same way I am telling that spent fuel was also, it was already dangerous. So this much volume of radioactivity was there, which was dangerous for us. We can't leave it in the open. If people get exposed to radiation coming out from there, they will be in danger. So what essentially we are doing, we are concentrating it into one small button. We can handle very easily this button. We can put it behind the public domain, public reach. It will be naturally easier to take care of that button, very small amount, as compared to a big mass. So I think this is essentially the advantage of closed fuel cycle, that it reduces the amount of high-level waste by concentrating. It concentrates radioactivity, but volume becomes very, very less, which can be managed. So you don't require Yucca mountains to keep that waste. Some used up mine somewhere, if it is available, or some barren land somewhere is available, we will go to a geologically appropriate site and we can keep these. And now to add to that, I'm telling now the new technology which is coming up, the accelerator driven systems, they are going to solve this problem also. See, earlier our high level waste, I had to work on a technology so that I should be able to store it for thousands of years. Okay, but now with ADS coming, maybe ADS is hardly I would say 2 decades away from us. Within 2 decades, okay, I can assure you I will not be there, but by the time you become of my age, you will probably see some operating ADS in the world. They will be operating. Okay, unfortunately, I will not be there to see them. Okay, so these accelerator driven systems, they are going to break these actinides into much smaller radioisotopes, much short lived. So the target is that all this high level waste, so called high level waste, which right now requires probably thousands of years of storage, will need only maximum 300 years of storage. And 300 years looks very possible by human beings. We see, for example, Taj Mahal is there for the last 300 years. There are a lot of historical monuments which we are able to take care for a period of beyond 300 years. So already with even the old technology and with the old construction technology, we are able to preserve things for more than 300 years. So I think with modern day technology and modern day construction technology, probably we can very easily do it. So I think I have answered your question, that this how it addresses the waste problem, it reduces the volume, and it is so that we are able to handle it in a much smaller and keep it away from public domain.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Yes, you're right, actually. I mean, in terms of managing a fuel, which is and radioactivity, it's no joke. So managing a fuel, it is better to have, smaller installations also where it can be properly guarded, and we can take care of how the material's lifespan is.
Sorry to interrupt. See, just to give you again an example, as you have named it, people should know. So people should know that currently we have 22 reactors working in the country. Two of them you remove, the BWRs, because they don't add to our nuclear waste. I mean, the way we can't reprocess that. So 20 reactors of which the fuel we can reprocess. Okay. Now fuel of all these 20 reactors, all for last 50 years, 50 or lesser number of years, the entire thing is being stored in one facility at Tara. And that facility, the size is smaller than a football field. So, and for, I think, another 20-30 years, the same facility will be able to take care of the entire nuclear waste generated from these 20 reactors. So you require much lesser space. If now you imagine if all the spent fuel had to be managed, probably we don't have Yucca Mountains, so probably we will be searching Vindhya Mountains or Mount Abu or maybe Everest itself. So would have been very difficult for it.
Definitely,
Yes,
sir. I totally agree with you. Okay, so sir, like you said, going back to the question that we were supposed to discuss, you yourself said that India started with light water reactor technology, and then we made a switch to the PHWRs, and now again we are moving towards the light water reactors. So, and also throughout the conversation, we came across terms like the fast breeder reactors and so on. So could you explain the role of these different kinds of reactors in the Indian nuclear program?
Now, first, let me tell you, as you told that we started, of course, I also told that we started our nuclear power program with 2 light water reactors. But essentially, personally, I do not consider them as part of our 3-stage nuclear power program. So, in fact, the term we use in our department is to jump start the nuclear power program. We went for those 2 reactors. Let me tell you, see, at that time, when we were building up the program, the late 50s and the early 60s, up to the unfortunate demise of Dr. Homi Jahangir Bhabha, let me tell you, the Indian program was taking a shape depending upon not only the scientific capabilities of Dr. Bhabha and the limited people he had around him, but also entirely on the PR skills of Dr. Bhabha. His PR skills. So I think part of our program was being decided by his PR skills. See, for example, the first research reactor we had, Apsara, it was, I would say it was not a technological decisions. It was not that we considered 5 designs and decided that this is the best design, so we will go for it. No, it happened because of friendship of Dr. Bhabha with somebody in UK. I'm not getting the name, probably Cockcroft. So Bhabha's personal friendship with him. In fact, they say, as I have heard the story, they had a bet because it was decided that Bhabha will build the reactor here in Bombay and he will supply the entire fuel. Cockcroft will give the fuel. So probably they had a bet that let us see who builds whether you build the reactor faster or I give the fuel faster. And they say that our building was ready. So Bhabha won the bet and his fuel had not come. So Bhabha, in fact, he informed him that my building, the reactor building is ready. Where is your fuel? So why I gave this story, people to know that in addition to scientific reasons, lot of things happened for the first time in India because of personal relationships of particularly of Dr. Bhabha. Similarly, this 2 light water reactors. See, Bhabha was one person. Maybe I'm drifting a little away from your question. Dr. Bhabha always was in a great hurry of doing things. That is why, in fact, I always throw it as a challenge to our current leaders of atomic energy. I always tell them that the amount of work Dr. Bhabha did between 1945 and his death, probably we require half a century nowadays to do that much of work. He was doing things overnight. He was in a hurry. And probably he knew why he was in hurry. See, once, I think a couple of months before his unfortunate death, in a public lecture he said the impact of life is decided by 2 things. One is duration of life. That means you get a lot of time to do some work. And the second thing is by the intensity of life. That means, so let us say if I was to define it mathematically, so let us say impact of life is the product of duration of life multiplied by intensity of life. Okay, if I was to give this equation, probably he knew, maybe I don't know whether he knew that, or in fact we should learn from him. All of us should assume that the time available is very less. So our intensity, we should keep it high right from the beginning, assuming that I am going to die tomorrow. So why not do it? I think our Kaal kare so aaj kare so ab. I mean, people have told us again the same philosophy that don't wait. That I have got many years. Usually people die only after 70. So I have got many years to do a lot of work. No. I should assume that I am going to die tomorrow. So why not finish everything today? So probably it is because of this mannerism that though he had decided that he will be going for a 3-stage nuclear power program, and for that he will be going to Canada, again his personal friend, the chairman of Atomic Energy Program of Canada, I'm slipping the name right now. So his personal friend. So he knew that ultimately we will be going for that, but that is going to take some time, he knew. So why not jumpstart the capacity? So those 2 light water reactors only came, so I would say, as an additionality to nuclear power program. Now coming to the present one. Present ones, there is slight difference. Still these light water reactors are coming as an additionality. But an additionality within the nuclear power program, within the 3-stage program. Because if you recollect, whatever agreements we had with different governments, and probably, I don't know, you must have been following up in newspapers and on internet, the discussions which were taking shape, particularly during the 1, 2, 3 agreement. And every day, some day it used to look like no, it is going to fizzle out. Probably Indo-US agreement may not take place, but then suddenly something promising will come out. And so much so that I very vividly recall that I saw one photograph that ultimately after the agreement was signed, and there was a customary photograph to be taken in which naturally Bush and Manmohan Singh were in the center, surrounded by other people. And at one far corner was Dr. Kakotkar standing. So after that photograph, Bush has walked up to Kakotkar. See, look at the US president walking to our Indian scientist. And there is a photograph. I saw a photograph where his hand is on his shoulder, and they seem to be talking to each other. So I asked Dr. Kakotkar, what was the conversation? He said, no, he simply, because Dr. Kakotkar had been described in US press as the 600-pound gorilla. See, during those discussions in the US media, he was described as a 600-pound gorilla. Means very stubborn, not listening to that. What was that stubbornness? We insisted initially, USA was not agreeing for right to reprocess. They wanted a Tarapur kind of a story, that fuel will come, we will use it once, and that's the end of it. He said, nothing doing, we have burnt our fingers in Tarapur. So we are going to agree for any of these agreements only if we have the right to reprocess. So this was very important. Why this was very important? Because that is how these new light water reactors which are being added now, 2 are already there, 2 are under construction, 2 are in the pipeline, and many more are in at least in the aerial pipelines. May not be solid pipelines, but aerial pipelines. So many light water reactors will be coming. Difference is, please remember that every gigawatt which is going to come, gigawatt of light water reactor which is going to come now from outside, it will give that gigawatt as that reactor, whatever is coming. Plus that gigawatt will get converted into minimum 10 gigawatt in the next 10 years by reprocessing. So because now whatever new LWRs will be coming, they will be coming with a right to reprocess. So we will be reprocessing that fuel, getting the plutonium from there and adding to our fast breeder reactor. No doubt, this all will be safeguarded because it is a foreign fuel. We don't mind safeguarding, but our electricity generation program will multiply. So we call it a multiplying effect. Today, whatever gigawatt we are buying from outside, that gigawatt is going to multiply at least 10 times in next 10 to 20 years. So that is very, very important. And similarly, of course, I think you asked about fast breeder reactor. As I told you, fast breeder reactor is an essential part of second stage. I mean, we cannot have second stage without the fast breeder reactor. In the third stage, again, probably we will have a choice. We can have a fast breeder or we can have ordinary. For example, AHWR is not going to be a fast breeder reactor. I mean, it is not going to be a fast reactor at least. I know we are using moderator there. But as such, AHWR is not a proper third stage reactor. It is something in between the second and the third stage. Third stage, basically, we are working on those molten salt reactors, high temperature reactors, and ADS systems. And these will come probably by the middle of the century because see, and I mean, don't get disheartened and tell your viewers, they also should not, I mean, they should not say something like, oh my God, they will come only in middle of the century. No, it is planned. Even if we can put up the thorium-based reactors today, no, we have done a lot of work. And for Indian program, with the amount of material available in India, we have a calculated and pre-planned program where we should inject thorium. We can work with thorium, but commercial injection of thorium into our electricity generation program should take only when we have reached 200 gigawatt installed capacity. So these calculations we have done in the department. And that 200 gig, so the plan is like this. We will have our our PHWR program. I will not include light water yet because that is additional. So I'm talking in terms of PHWRs. We will have a program of 10,000 megawatt of installed capacity of PHWRs. It may not grow further because by that time we add more reactors, some will have to be decommissioned. So maybe the peak will be of around 10 gigawatt, so 10,000 megawatt. Then fast breeder reactors will take us to 2 gigawatt, 200 gigawatt. Okay, so 200,000 megawatt. That is the time we should inject thorium into the system. It is because it's a very delicate balance. Please remember, we have only this much uranium-235. We have this much uranium-238, and we have this much thorium. It is very, very judiciously we have to use this material, because if like a crazy fellow, we spend all the uranium-235, all the uranium-238 and thorium is going to lie useless. And probably that time, even the foreign countries may not give us U-235, knowing very well that it will give us the capability of using our uranium-238 and thorium. So it is very, very, actually it is required. We should not be in a hurry. So that probably is again going to be in the middle of the century. We are developing the technology. As you know, our FBTR contains that carbide fuel, mixed carbide fuel. Our PFBR contains MOX fuel, uranium plutonium mixed oxide. But we are also working on what are known as metallic fuel fast breeder reactors. Now, so I will again not bore your viewers with the technical nuances, but let me tell you the advantage of metallic fuel fast breeder reactors is the doubling time. What is doubling time? Like we have half-life. You know, when some isotope is decaying, so we say time required, time in which its amount becomes half. Similarly, when something is breeding, so fuel is breeding, we have doubling time. In how much time our quantity of fissile material will double. That is the time. That time is a little longer when you have oxide or carbide fuels. But if you have metallic fast breeder reactors, the doubling time reduces. So that means the growth of fissile material, growth of plutonium-239 inventory is faster. So ultimately, I think we are a couple of years away from development of that technology. I personally believe that by 2030, we should be in a position to launch metallic fuel-based fast breeder reactors. And with that, so probably 2030s will see setting up of many fast breeder reactors, which will be probably based on this metallic fuels. So up to 2050, they will give us enough plutonium, and enough thorium would have been converted into uranium-233 to inject it commercially. Unfortunately, again, I will not be there to witness that. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Sure, you're right about I would like to comment that you're absolutely right about the usefulness of metallic fuels. In fact, when I was a student during my master's education, we had this opportunity to go to the Indira Gandhi Center for Atomic Research. And during that 1 month period of time, we was assigned a project, and I specifically was working on, studying the allowable power limits and how the metallic fuel actually works. So I'm pretty sure that and I'm confident that it will be a better step in the future. And yes, I mean, being closely associated with that, even for a short duration, was actually an extremely I would say proud moment for me. So, sir, you mentioned about the advanced heavy water reactor and how it is somewhere between, it links the first and the third stage of the Indian power program. So, could you maybe elaborate on how this choice of using the advanced heavy water reactor technology could change or could bring any sort of modification or enhancement to this Indian power program?
Actually, I will tell you, I mean, it's my personal opinion. Don't take it as a government policy or the department policy. Now, having known this advancement of ASWR, development of ASWR, first thing is let me tell what are the plus points. What are we going to gain by this ASWR? One is the actually it has nothing to do with the stages. It is to do with the reactor design with that, passive safety features. See, there are a lot of passive safety features. See, if you compare, for example, with Fukushima. At Fukushima, one problem which happened was that LOCA happened, loss of coolant accident took place. So there was no coolant water available. Now, you mean to say there was no water available? No, water was available. But there was a pump which needed to be started. But there was no electricity to start that pump. So for many hours, this went off. And since no cooling water could be provided because there was there was total station blackout. So because of absence of electricity, they could not provide cooling water to the reactor. And so ultimately it burst. That hydrogen was produced. See, steam came into contact with hot metal, and by a established chemistry, water broke into hydrogen and oxygen, and that hydrogen and oxygen recombined in the form of an explosion. And all this happened, whatever happened. So now compare it with ASWR. In ASWR, there is thermosiphoning. Okay. So, for example, in the case of LOCA condition, there is no requirement of a pump to be started. In fact, there is a provision where gravity-driven system will be there, which will take care of the LOCA condition. So, to me, HWR is important from that point of view. That probably when we design and put up, in fact, we have designed the HWR, but when we put up the HWR and we operate it for some years, maybe, in fact, I look forward that we will put the same passive safety feature in our PHWRs and our fast breeder reactors. So I look AHWR more as a technology demonstrator for these passive safety features. And third thing is that normally we are taught, and in fact, I remember my training school days that one essential condition of putting up a nuclear power plant is that in 1.6 kilometer radius, you will not allow anything. So from the center of my reactor, you draw a circle of 1.6 kilometer. No entry for anybody. So this itself, public acceptance, it suffers because of this. That they say, oh, only this much reactor in maybe 100, 200 meter, but up to 1.6 kilometer, they are not allowing it. That means that 1.6 kilometer must be full of radioactivity. That is what the public gets. Though it is not a fact, I know that it is a very rich land actually, and in fact, a variety of flora and fauna are found in that 1.6 kilometer. But public gets a message that in that gap of 1.6 kilometer, maybe the soil has become totally radioactive, and that is why they are not allowing anybody to enter. So again, I have my hopes on AHWR, because AHWR, they say they are confident that they don't require any such 1.6 kilometer space. In fact, they say in the middle of a market or inside a colony, residential colony, this AHWR can be put. So probably that will give us a lot of public confidence. I think nowadays you must have heard a lot about these small and medium sized reactors, SMRs. So I would put AHWR into that category because these SMRs are again supposed to give us a uh, boost in public acceptance that in any densely populated area, any SMR or at least the small reactor can be small modular reactor, it can be put. Okay. So I think same thing we will gain from AHWR. I think as far as our third stage, earlier probably in 1990 when this concept developed, probably we were seeing it as a step forward towards third stage. Personally, I feel now we have other reactor systems on which we are already working. They are ADS, they are molten salt breeder reactor, they are the compact high temperature reactor. Probably they will take us towards the third stage, not essentially AHWR. So I think AHWR still remains an important reactor, but it's at least in my eyes, its usability has changed.
Thank you, sir. Yes, you're right. In terms of if you compare it to the small modular reactors, AHWRs actually do have a lot of similar features in terms
Yeah,
of installation, easy
yeah,
installation,
yeah,
and
yeah,
the power density that can be generated out of it, and also in terms of the safety, overall
yeah,
safety of the
yeah.
nuclear installation. So, sir, we talked about the different fuels that are, in the planned phase of the Indian three-stage program, and we also know that India has abundance of thorium as a natural reserve, which was actually, if I'm correct, which was the base point of uh, planning our entire nuclear program around this point, that we have to ultimately utilize the thorium reserves that are there in India. So, given this entire journey that we've had for the different stages, how far do you think we are from, actually using commercial thorium reactors for power production?
I think I told you, maybe not before middle of the century. See, by 2050, see, it all depends. As I told you, we have to first have 200 gigawatt of fast breeder reactor capacity. And another condition is we should develop, and this 200 should come, majority of it should be based on metallic fuel reactor. Okay, so that the doubling period will be doubling period for both, for plutonium as well as for uranium 233. That will get a bit closer. Now, in the meanwhile, see, right now when we are taught in our training programs or when we are studying, how is thorium introduced into fast breeder reactor? See, thorium is introduced in PHWR also, but as an adjuster rod. Prime purpose is not conversion of thorium into uranium 233, but to adjust the power. So they are essentially known as adjuster rods. Okay, in PHWR. In FBRs, basically these compound fuel, I mean carbide fuel or oxide fuel, how you are introducing thorium there as a blanket material. That means you have a fuel bundle. Surrounding that, you can have thorium tubes. You can't put thorium in the core of the fuel, inside the fuel. You can't put in mixed oxide fuel. Okay. Until you do that, your doubling rate is not going to increase. So main advantage with the metallic fuel reactor is going to be that then this thorium will move from blanket material to core fuel material. So thorium you will be able to put into the fuel rod along with the fissile material. So naturally you will get more neutrons. I mean thorium will see more neutrons. So there will be faster growth. So until unless we achieve that, and so it looks possible to me that, as I already told you, I'm again repeating, the decades of 30s and 40s probably will see uh, multiple number of metallic fuel-based fast breeder reactors being put up in the country. So let us say by 2040-45, we achieve an installed capacity of 200 gigawatt. And at that time, we move thorium from blanket material to the core of the fuel. Up to that time, we are converting thorium. We are converting thorium even today in our FBTR. We will be converting some thorium in our PFBR. We will be converting some thorium in our future fast breeder reactors based on mixed oxide. So there will be some inventory of uranium-233, but this inventory will develop very fast, will double very fast once we move to the metallic fuel reactor and we move thorium from blanket material to the core of the fuel. Then that fast multiplication will occur, and probably we will have enough. And by that time, we would have developed, in fact, I'm not saying one or two, maybe two or three technologies where you can use uranium-233. Those will be, naturally, those will be some kind of these high temperature reactors. They will be ADS systems, and they will be molten salt reactors. AHWR, again, I don't think, see, AHWR, probably it is essential to put it up. And I don't think we are going to multiply AHWRs. I don't know when we will put up the first one. I personally do not expect a second one, but definitely I don't think we can go beyond 2 or 3. So AHWR is never going to be a part of our, nuclear power program. It is going to be an important step, that's all.
Thank you, sir. I really hope this final stage of using the commercial thorium reactors comes soon, and we also get a chance to contribute to this.
In fact, I am telling you, please have patience.
Yes, sir, definitely.
Don't wish that it comes soon. See, I mean, somebody in a crazy manner to satisfy the Indian public injects it soon, our program may die. So please don't wish for that. You only wish that our fast breeder reactor program comes up fast. I think that is more essential. If it comes fast, the thorium will automatically come fast.
Okay. So keeping our fingers crossed in that that case then. Okay, so this brings us to the end of today's episode. I thank you, sir, on behalf of all our viewers and also the team of Indian Youth Nuclear Society for taking out this time to interact with us and, responding to all the questions that may be in the minds of not just me, but also our viewers, and bringing out a whole new perspective on the Indian nuclear program. So thank you to you once again. And I thank our viewers as well for tuning into our channel today and watching this session. We really hope you enjoyed it, and we always welcome more questions that you may have so that we can ask our experts and clarify any doubts that you may have. So for everybody tuned into our channel, please take care, stay safe, and have a very good evening.
Thank you, Vaishnavi.
Thank you, sir.